So put some little flags in the front of the book. That way, as you're reading, you can peel those off and mark things.
Well, as a life coach and a Jesus follower and someone who loves to learn, I read several dozen nonfiction, personal growth type books in a year. But if I'm reading so many of those books and getting rid of most of them when I'm done with them, how do I actually implement all that information? Is everything that I'm learning about faith and health and parenting and time management and business actually sticking?
Well, I've got 12 very nerdy yet relatively simple tips to share with you to help you answer that question. Tip number 10 is very nerdy but very helpful. I can pretty much guarantee you've never heard this idea before. And the last two tips are probably my favorite and the easiest, so stick around for those. And by the way, I had this idea so that you don't feel overwhelmed as you're listening to this or feel like you need to take notes. I made a downloadable PDF cheat sheet that summarizes everything from this video. So just click the link in the description below for that one-page cheat sheet. You can print it out and tuck it in the next book that you're reading. Okay, so tips 1 through 3 are for before you start reading. So number 1, ask yourself, why am I reading this book? And then you can even put a post-it on the cover of it or write it on a piece of paper. So I am reading Tiny Habits right now, and I wrote on this piece of paper, like, my goal, create habits to support the new me that I want to be in our new house, because we're moving this weekend. And so I'm just using that as my bookmark, and it reminds me then when I open this book why I'm reading it. And I wrote some ideas of habits on the back side of that piece of paper. I love asking myself questions about the end result that I'm after when I do just about anything in life. It totally changes the way that you approach that thing. And so knowing your purpose for reading a book is going to help you get the information that you most need from that book. Tip number 2 is before you add a book to your bookshelf, like, you just bought it or you just got it from the library, put a post-it in the front of the book with the name of the book. And then when you're done, you're going to take that post-it out. That will prompt you to add that book title to your completed books list. I keep a list of every book that I read throughout the year, and then I share it on my blog, and I'll share links to those posts below. Starting in 2021, I decided to not just keep a list of the books, just the titles, but also write a 1 to 3 sentence summary of each book, which is obviously helpful for my audience in deciding if they want to buy it, but it also helps me remember my favorite point from the book and kind of forces me to summarize it. And since I don't keep most of the books that I read, having that list of everything, it makes it easier for me to get rid of them, and it also helps me remember all those books if there's a book that I might want to revisit in the future. Tip number 3, you put post-it flags in the front of the book to mark things as you're reading. I'm going to talk about this more in a second, but speaking of, is this video sponsored by Post-it? I wish it was. But so put some little flags in the front of the book. That way, as you're reading, you can peel those off and mark things. So tips 4 through 8 now are about being an active learner as you read. And there are a lot of tips here. I forbid you to try them all. Do not get overwhelmed. I help women simplify their lives and live more intentionally. This is not about complication or getting stressed out. The point here is to just be good stewards of the information that God has blessed us with and hopefully enjoy the process of reading. And remember, I've got that cheat sheet summary of all these tips that you can download so that you can see all these tips in one place and decide what you want to try yourself. So tip number 4 is I recommend that you buy books that you really want to absorb and then mark them up. I love library books and I love ebooks, but you are going to absorb more information with a book that you can physically hold and mark up and write in. So I checked out Tiny Habits from the library recently. It was so good that partway through I realized that I was going to return it and buy it so that I could really mark it up and digest the information. And this is a rare book that as I was reading it, I was like, I am definitely going to want to come back to this book. So I wanted to own it and be able to mark it up and come back to those notes. Now, you don't have to buy new books, especially if you know that you're going to get rid of it when you're done. You can always buy used. I like a website called gettextbooks.com. You just type in a book and it will compare prices for any book across numerous sites online. It'll show them all to you and show you what condition they're in.
Yes, these are the only books that I own. I pulled them all out because I have to pack them. We're actually moving this weekend, and I am so thankful to be a minimalist when it comes to having to pack up my books. If you need some more motivation and ideas on deciding what books to keep and what to get rid of, check out the playlist that I linked below. It's part of Dawn, the Minimal Mom's Mega Motivation collaboration for this month, and other YouTubers are going to be sharing how they decide what to keep and what to pitch. So thank you so much, Dawn, for creating this collaboration. I love Dawn. If you guys didn't find me through her, go check her out. And if this is your first time here, welcome, and thank you so much for being here. And please subscribe if you want to hang out more and just talk about living intentionally, very practical tips for living an intentional life with a Jesus focus to all of that.
Tip number 5, come up with your own nerdy system for note-taking and marking things. And knowing why you're reading the book, like we talked about before, knowing why you're reading the book and taking notes in the first place is going to help you decide how you might want to take notes. So for example, if it's something that you want to take action on, maybe your system is that you mark that thing with a star. Or if there's a quote that you want to share with someone, you mark that with a heart. If there's something that I'm like, ooh, I want to bring that up with book club, I will dog ear it. That's my system. I also like to underline things as I'm reading. Sometimes I will actually underline with the intent that I could kind of reread that book in the future again with primarily just the underlines and get a good summary of it. And yeah, that takes more time to read a book that way and underline things, but it sticks so much better, even if I never read that book again. And if I do read it again, I can read mostly just the underlines and pretty much get the same results as if I read the whole thing. And this is where the Post-its come in, talking about like how you're going to take notes, especially if you're reading a book that isn't yours. So what I will do is I will mark, again, we're getting real nerdy here, but book nerds got to have their systems. If there is like a very specific thing that I like, I will mark it with the flag and I will put it right on the line where that thing is. If I'm like, oh my gosh, I loved this whole paragraph, like all the way down a ways, I will put it at an angle so that tells me when I come back to look through my notes, like, okay, it wasn't just this paragraph that I liked, there was more stuff, so keep reading. Tip number 6, tough love. Take notes only if you have a very clear intent for the notes. I actually very rarely take notes from books because I just know and I've accepted that I am not the kind of person who goes back and rereads notes that I saved in a Google Doc or a notebook somewhere. If you're that kind of person, then great. But if I'm taking notes, whether it's a sermon or a conference or a book, I throw them out when I'm done, because just taking the notes, just that practice of being an active learner, that served its purpose. And one idea that I've heard different versions of from Tim Ferriss as well as Michelle Myers from She Works His Way is that if you want, you could actually kind of write your notes in the front of the book. So create like a table of contents for yourself in the front of the book, write your favorite concepts and the page numbers, and that can be kind of an interesting way to kind of grab your favorite things. But again, be realistic with yourself. Are you really going to come back to those notes? And if not, then that should change the way that you approach them, right? Or whether you even take them at all. Tip number 7, actually answer those reflection questions that they put at the end of the chapter or the end of the book. Trust me, I often skip over those questions just like everyone else. But do you know what books I look back on that are typically most life-changing for me? I don't think they're necessarily the books that were the best. They're often the books that I just put the most effort into to really digest them and work through things, and especially when I work through the questions that the author provides. Now, not every question may apply to you. They're not all going to be helpful or equally valuable. So maybe you kind of pick and choose. But working through those questions makes such a difference. It's like very, very cheap coaching. Tip number 8. As you're reading through a book or once you're done with it, talk about what you're learning with other people. That helps you retain and understand that information. If you have a background in education like I do, you know that teaching something to someone else helps it to stick more for you. Talk about it with your spouse, your friends, you know, if you have an online business or some form of business and you can share things that you're learning. All of that is helping you to process through that information for yourself and summarize it and absorb it. And by the way, a life coach or a therapist, if you have one, is a great person to share about a book with. I have helped many of my clients work through various nonfiction books and implement them in their lives on everything from spiritual life to business to simplifying to parenting and more. So if you're curious about working with me, we have a wait list right now, but we actually probably finally have some spots opening up soon. So you can check, I'll put a link below to learn more about coaching with me. Tips 8 through, or 9, what are we up to? 9 through 12 are going to be about how to implement a book once you're done reading it. So tip number 9, now you're going to go through and process your notes. So whether you put stars, or you dog-eared things, or you underline, or you put the little post-it flags in, you're going to go back and do something. That might mean that there are books that were mentioned in the book that you want to check out and add to your reading list. Or maybe you're going to text a photo of a page with a really good paragraph to share with your sister. Or you're going to share a quote or a snippet of something on social media. Or you're going to buy something that was recommended in the book. You're going to download an app that was mentioned. You're going to start a habit mentioned in the book, etc., etc., etc. You get the idea. But just make sure that you can be as specific as possible on what action you're going to take. The less vague you are, the more likely you are to do it. A couple of books that I read, just to give you an example, like a couple of books that I read in the past couple months really were encouraging me to want to be in the Word more and all throughout the day. And so instead of just making a vague commitment to myself, like I should be in the Word more, I made a decision and took a very specific action and decided I'm going to keep my Bible open on the kitchen counter right by our family command center at all times. And it's been awesome. So I took that general, vague conviction or idea from what I was reading, and I turned it into something very specific. And as you're processing notes from your book, you really want to join the Nerds Club. You might want to try a book weight to hold your book open. As a minimalist, I tried so hard to avoid buying one of these once I discovered that they existed because it seemed absolutely ridiculous. But I love this thing, and I've given these to 2 pastors as gifts, and they're obsessed too. So like this thing these are heavy, it's weighted. And so when you have your book open and you're trying to type something out, which this will come in handy when I share with you my very nerdy tip number 10, just set this on your book and it keeps your book open. So you're not like holding it with your elbow or trying to balance something else heavy on top of it, which really works. I'll put a link to the nerdy book weight below, again, if you really want to join the Nerds Club. Okay, tip number 10 is still about processing the notes from the book, but it's so nerdy and awesome that it deserves its own number on this list. And that is this: create a grow list with your favorite concepts from books that aren't ultra actionable, that aren't as easy to take action on. Here's how I do this. So here in Todoist, which is where I keep track of all my business and personal tasks, I created this list called Grow. And on that list, I add my favorite concepts from books that I read when I really want to remember that concept, but it's not something that I can take action on super easily. So this is not perfect by any means, but I will sometimes create these tasks, these notes based on a single book, or sometimes it's like based on a topic, like where I will add in multiple things that I learned about stress from various books all into one thing, or about marriage or whatever. And then so that I actually make sure that I read all these great notes instead of them being in a Google Doc graveyard somewhere that I will never open, I set these notes with due dates to be recurring for every 2 months. So I have space basically I have space for up to 60 book notes in here, and typically then just one of them pops up per day when I look at my tasks for the day. So this is like the fun little reminder, a fun little tip today that came from a book or something. And you can see more of those, how there will be one per day. If I come across one that's not helpful anymore, I'll just delete it. Here is actually, I want to show you, I think this is really powerful and really relevant to what we're talking about right now. This is a note that I have related to content consumption, and some notes that I took based on like things I've read and things I've learned and had realizations about over the years. So I try to ask myself when I feel like saving notes on something, is it worth sacrificing some of my peace to save this information? And I also try to ask myself, when and how would I access that information if I saved it? And how useful would it be at that time in the future when I did access it or come across it? Because let's be honest, like usually we're not even going to remember that we saved that information and come back to it. And I love, love, love this quote from Jen Wilkins' book, None Like Him. She says, as you survey the information buffet, so this is a question to help you be mindful about the content you're consuming and not just totally gorging yourself on content. So as you survey the information buffet, ask yourself, will the time and attention I give to this make me more like Christ? Will it make me better able to serve God and serve others? Am I feeding my intellect in a way that enables me to love the Lord my God with all of my mind, or in a way that causes information overload? Does what I'm learning cause me to worship myself, or cause me to marvel at the wondrous works of Him who is perfect in knowledge? So good. Now, if your head's feeling a little overwhelmed, just stop, take a deep breath. Remember that even just doing one of these things would be helpful. It's going to help you get more out of the books you're reading. And if you want some very simple tips, you're going to like these last two the best. So tip number 11 is choose just one thing to implement from the book. Yep, just one. When you finish a book, ask yourself, if I only took one action from this book that would be the most powerful, what would it be? And hint, this is a great thing to ask yourself after you listen to a podcast episode, or sit in church for a sermon, or you listen to a YouTube video like this. So just encourage yourself, I'm going to implement one thing. What would be the most powerful thing? And then do that well. And sometimes that makes a bigger difference than trying to implement 10 different things, but not really doing any of them well, because you're just spreading yourself too thin. Tip number 12 is give yourself permission to implement nothing from the book if you'd like to. Especially if you're like me and you enjoy learning just for the fun of it, you are allowed to enjoy reading a book about productivity or about your faith life and then not take any tangible steps at all. I think just reading a book is going to influence you in some positive ways. And to me, that's just fun. That is how I want to spend free time. So even if you are not taking very tangible steps, you can just read a book and enjoy it. You do not have to always implement something. And this was something that I kind of struggled with for years, where I felt like, oh, I'm reading too many books. I'm not fully implementing every single thing I read. And then I realized that the point for me of reading those books was not just to grow and mature and learn new things that I put into practice. Part of it is just the fun of it. So that's okay. You have permission to not implement something from a book if you'd like. So speaking of tip number 11, where we talked about choosing just one thing to implement, I really encourage you, download that cheat sheet PDF summary that I created. The link is below this video. You'll see that there's space on that page to kind of figure out what's just one thing I'm going to try for myself and how am I going to make that happen. I'll kind of coach you through that on that page. And you can also comment on this video and tell me just one thing that you're going to try. It's a lot, so don't try to do it. Don't try to do it all. And again, please subscribe, and I'll see you again soon.